Well, good evening. My name is Lyle Williams. I'm the Curator of Collections here at the McNay Art Museum. And this evening I'm greeting you from the print room of the McNay. I'll tell you a little bit about this space and really the reason why we decided to do this evening. Under normal circumstances, during the school year, we get around 100 or a couple of hundred area high school and college and university students whose professors or art teachers make an appointment to come in as a group, and I do pretty much for them what I'm going to do for you this evening. And it's really one of the great functions of the print room that we can have people come in and these young students can have a one-on-one relationship with a particular work of art. It's very intimate. And oftentimes, I always say this, when a student comes in and is looking at a work of art for the first time, I can almost see a little light bulb going off on top of their head. So for me, it's one of the more exciting functions of the space. And so I was in here not too long ago working on a checklist for an upcoming exhibition. And I was very sad. Just a wave of sadness came over me because we can't have people in the print room anymore, at least for the time being. And so I talked to Kate Carey, our head of education, and I said, I'd really like to do something to remedy that. And so we came up with this idea. And actually it's Kate's idea to focus on the topic of summer in the print room. So that's what we'll be looking at this evening. What you see around in the room, this is not only a classroom, but it's also print storage. So I would say about 75% of our collection is actually stored in this space. So it's a multifunction kind of space. And if you've never been, this is, I guess, sort of an introduction for you. So we're going to start with this beautiful Robert Motherwell Perpetual Summer that's on the easel behind me. Looking at it, it's obviously not representational. It's completely abstract. The thing that reminds me about summer about it is his use of color. So the background that you see, this sort of yellowish ochre color, is actually an Aqua Tent, so that's actually printed. But then he went back in and he tore out bits of paper to hand apply to the top of the Aqua Tent. So no two prints from this edition, there's a very small edition of only 26, but no two prints are exactly the same, they're all unique. But the thing about the yellow and the thing about this blue is it makes me think of the seashore. The yellow can be seen as a patch of sand. The blue, rather, can be seen as the ocean or the sea. And in fact, the artist, Motherwell, spent quite a lot of his summers in Provincetown in Massachusetts at the coast. And in fact, he was married at one point to a fellow abstract expressionist artist, Helen Frankenthaler. And she and he spent the early 1960s in Provincetown. It's in fact where Motherwell died himself years later. So we start off with a completely abstract work that sort of is evocative of the feeling of summer without representing summer in a literal kind of way. So shall I move on to the next?
Yeah, let's go on to the next one.
All right. So this is a masterful watercolor by the San Antonio artist Ivan McDougall. And it's called The Shell Hunters, and it dates to 1980. Now back in decades before I even arrived, the McNay hosted an annual watercolor exhibition and competition called the Texas Watercolor Society Show. And every year, the winner from the show was acquired by the museum. And in fact, Ivan McDougall's work directly behind me, The Shell Hunters, was the winner in 1980. So he was part of the watercolor gang, which is sort of a famous group of watercolorists who often traveled together and painted together at different locales, both in the state, nationally, and internationally. McDougall spent quite a lot of time doing watercolors in Scotland. But one of their favorite spots to go was the coastal bend here in Texas, and so they would spend time in Port Aransas and Rockport. And I think that the shell hunters that you see here, I think this is a Rockport scene. There's a structure right here that I can't quite identify, but I think that's actually Rockport. But this is such a masterful watercolor with just hyper realism, and the way he gets the reflections on this water, almost like a mirror-like surface in the shallows at the beach, with the three main figures searching for shells, and they carry these sort of commercial grade large buckets to collect their shells in. But just a beautiful example of the watercolorist's art. Any questions about that?
We don't have any questions coming in just yet. We encourage you guys to ask questions. Lyle is here to answer anything you'd like to know about the prints. But we did have a few comments. People can't believe that the McDougall watercolor is a watercolor.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's really technically quite a feat.
And then Ann Schaefer on Facebook Erica Ramirez just said, love that you were offering this.
Great. Yeah, so if anyone can identify the scene, I'd appreciate that. I think it's Rockport, but I could be completely wrong. It's definitely not Port Aransas, but. Try to get this back in place. Of course, now that I'm on camera, it doesn't cooperate. So while we're talking about watercolors, let's look at the next one in the stack, which is by a Taos school artist named Ward Lockwood. And it's called Summer in Taos. So probably from the 1930s. Lockwood moved to New Mexico, specifically Taos, in 1926, and he quickly became friends with other watercolorists and modernists. Out in the New Mexican landscape, he often painted with the American modernist John Marin, and oftentimes, you can actually compare two watercolors that they both did of the same subject. So you can sort of imagine these artists who have come to New Mexico mainly for the light quality. You can imagine them working side by side. So in this particular image, it's the thing that's so remarkable about it is that it's a bequest of Mrs. McNay. So, Mrs. McNay was a great watercolorist herself and collected really, really great watercolors. And this is one of them. And one of the reasons I love it so much is because it's so incredibly fresh. The colors just sort of burst off the page. I especially love this brilliant blue here, which really suggests the quality of the sky in New Mexico in the summer, when it's perfectly dry and the air is so clean and clear. And that was the light effects that a lot of these artists were trying to achieve in their watercolors. So it's probable that Mrs. McNay knew Ward Lockwood, as she did Summer in Taos as well. And he also later in his career became an art professor at UT Austin, just up the road. So there are some nice connections between Ward Lockwood and Texas as well.
Lyle, we had a question come in. Someone wants to know more about your love for printmaking and how you became interested in it.
It's a great question. I had a great aunt who lived in Corpus Christi when I was a kid. And often I would go visit her for long weekends in the summer. And I call her my South Texas Auntie Mame. She was a little offbeat, a little crazy, but just tremendous amounts of fun. And I adored her, and I think she was really, really fond of me as well. After her husband died, she sort of went a little crazy and went on a world trip and bought a lot of 19th century French prints. So when I would go down and stay with her, I would look at these objects on the wall, and I became fascinated by the different textures of the paper, the different way that the inks would lie on the sheet of paper. So it was a very early introduction to printmaking. So it was really because of my beloved Aunt Norma that I got into the field. It's a great question. And it's why I still have a big soft spot in my heart for Corpus Christi as well. So one of the things, this is Ralston Crawford. It's called Gray Street. It's from the early 1940s. It's a screen print, which is interesting because screen printing really didn't become a fine art printmaking process until really later in the 1940s. So this is a real pioneering effort by Ralston Crawford, who's most often associated with American modernism, but also precisionist painting and printmaking. So he was a colleague of Charles Sheeler's, and often his works concentrate on industrial themes. But he also did a number of works about highways. And when I think about summer, I often think about road trips that I took with my parents when I was a young kid out to West Texas. So the idea of this road sort of disappearing on the horizon is very evocative to me of one of my favorite summer activities, taking a road trip with family or friends. One of the fascinating things about it is the cloud up in the sky. So it's all screen printed, so it all goes through this very fine mesh of fabric. But he was able actually to get sort of the wispy quality of the cloud up in the sky. So it's remarkable from a technical standpoint as well. He traveled, he had great wanderlust, which is another reason why I find his work so fascinating. He really traveled the world and actually spent time here in Texas as well.
We have a question on Instagram from JQR Haldor. They want to know what makes a screen print different than a regular print.
So a screen print is a kind of printmaking. It's just a very specific kind. It works much like a stencil works. So if you've ever had your house number stenciled on the curb outside of your house, it's pretty much the same process. They create a design and then they block out where they don't want the ink to go through the actual mesh that I mentioned. And sometimes you hear them called silk screens, which is sort of a misnomer. These days, most screen prints are printed with, man-made fibers like a polyester, but it works very much like a stencil. And we have a very, very strong collection of screen prints in the collection. In fact, we'll see one in just a minute. Because of the Romero gifts of contemporary Latina printmaking, screen printing is cheaper than most printmaking processes, and it's easy to teach as well. So it's very, very popular in schools, and it's a very popular way of getting people introduced to printmaking. So a lot of Latino printmakers in Southern California and here in Texas up at Coronado Studios in Austin got their start as printmakers doing screen prints. This next work is by Edward Hopper, and it is one of the masterpieces of our collection. It's called The Henry Ford, obviously not a portrait of the automaker, but a ship named after Henry Ford. In 1922, there was a race established between Canadian fishermen and American fishermen up off the northeastern coast. And in 1923, the race was held near Gloucester, and Edward Hopper happened to be spending the summer in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And so we see the Henry Ford sailing by this rock outcropping with spectators who are out watching the race, watch this amazing boat sail by, probably at fantastic speed. So this is one of only 4 known impressions of the Henry Ford. It's a very, very rare print. We're extremely fortunate to have it in the collection. And from a condition standpoint, from an impression quality standpoint, it's really as good as it gets. A beautiful, pristine sheet. And I love the way that in the foreground, these probably granite outcroppings are drawn with this really heavy, really thick etched line. So they have this weight to them. But if you look at the sails, Hopper modulates the line there, so it's much softer. And you get a sense of sort of the wispy sails being blown by the wind. So the contrast in line in the print is really quite amazing. I'm a sailor too, so I happen to really love it.
Lyle, we've had a few questions come in wondering about if there is special care that has to be taken when storing watercolors or other works on paper. And there was someone interested in the paper that's on top of the work of art.
Okay, good question. Yes, paper is an amazing material. It's an amazing substance. We have paper made by the Egyptians that's thousands of years old. So in the right conditions, the right circumstances, paper can be quite durable. It is susceptible to damage by light, by moisture, and of course some bugs like to eat paper. So we do everything we can to ensure that our collection is here, not only for the present, but for future generations as well. And so everything that you see that comes into contact with the prints that we've been looking at is completely archival, meaning it's acid-free. It'll never stain the actual print itself. Everything is attached with a methyl cellulose and these beautiful Japan paper hinges. If we ever needed to take one of these works out of its mat for whatever reason, you just take a distilled deionized water solution and the glue dissolves without damaging the print at all. So there are a lot of precautions that we have to take in order to ensure, the condition of the collection moving forward. But that's what a curator does.
We actually had a question come in from Ann Schaefer about the Hopper etching. They want to know why were there only 4 impressions made? Why is it so rare?
So oftentimes with the artists, working with American artists working in New York in the 1920s, they didn't really have access to the funds to create huge editions. And so oftentimes, as is the case with Hopper and also with Reginald Marsh and many others, they would oftentimes pull a few artist proofs and then never have the time or the funds to go back and produce a larger edition. So in the case of the Henry Ford, it was just never had the resources to do it. Another great question. Oops. All right. So this is one of the prints that inspired the topic this evening. This is George Schreiber, and it's called Simply Summer. Schreiber was a Belgian-born artist, and he brought that sort of foreign-born perspective to American culture. He was really fascinated by this country and spent a lot of time traveling from all the way from the Canadian border down to the Gulf of Mexico. He fell in love with the country and eventually settled here. Summer is, I think, one of his most beautiful prints, where you see these wispy summer clouds up in the sky. This is a stack of wheat and a woman standing next to I think it's actually corn, so corn stacks. But looking at this, you can almost feel sort of the hot, dry wind blowing across the plain and making the corn husks sort of rustle in the breeze. So also fascinated by single figures in the landscape. So there's definitely a sense of sort of man or woman in this case versus nature. Also a sense of, the isolation that occurs on the American plains. Any questions?
We have several comments coming in right now about how amazing the detail is, how
Yes.
realistic the texture is. how fun and interesting the live is. Thank you for tuning in. And Sue Grant from South Dakota said, thank you. It's great to see the collection from South Dakota.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah, he's a masterful printmaker, not as well known as some of his colleagues, not as well known as Grant Wood or Thomas Hart Benton, but he certainly deserves to be. One of the things about this print that is pretty fascinating is that it was actually published by an outfit in New York called Associated American Artists. And in the 30s and 40s, they wanted really to democratize art. They wanted to make art accessible to a wider audience and to, so that art wasn't just for the ultra wealthy. And so you could subscribe to AAA's art program, and they would send you by mail every month a new lithograph. And you paid, very little money, just a few dollars if memory serves. And you can still walk into houses and still see these AAA prints that the family acquired, by mail, really decades ago. This is Grant Wood. It's called Sultry Night. And it's probably the most famous of the Associated American Artists prints. It's famous, or rather infamous, because you would subscribe to the Associated American Artists, and then they would send you your art through the U.S. Postal Service. But the U.S. Postal Service saw this print in 1939 when it was produced, and they deemed it pornographic, because obviously it's a nude farmer sort of bathing himself out in the open, out in the outdoors with a water trough. So it never made it to homes in the Midwest, or it had to be sold in person in New York at the Associated American offices in New York. And they also, because they couldn't mail it out, they limited the edition. Usually a AAA print is done in an edition of 250. This one was only done in an edition of about 150. So they cut back on the edition, and you could only buy it in person in New York because the Postal Service refused to send it through the mail.
A few questions.
Okay.
This one is about the summer print, and I know that a lot of the prints are on the theme of summer, but I think it was the last one.
Yes.
And they want to know, what is it carved or printed from? Is it an etching on metal?
It is not I'll put it back up. It is not an etching. It is a lithograph. And so one of the reasons it has this incredible detail is, so Schreiber would have taken a piece of limestone, a specific limestone from Bavaria, which is very, very fine grained. He would have drawn his design directly onto the stone with a greasy ink. And when the stone was sent through the press, the greasy printer's ink was attracted to the drawing, but repelled by other parts of the stone where water had been affixed. And so the lithography is based on the antipathy of oil and water. So it's the first really modern kind of printmaking that we know about. It was invented in the late 18th century, so we know when it was invented and by whom, a man named Alois Senefelder. The other etching processes, the other printing processes, like engraving, we don't really know who the first engraver was, but we know the first lithographer. So it's a fascinating process. But the thing about the process that's so appealing to artists is the fact that anything that they draw on the surface of the stone gets printed onto the paper. So it's a very direct transfer of the design from the matrix, the stone, to the actual work of art, to the print.
Ooh, this is a great question that came in, and then I think we'll have time for the last one or wrap up last questions. But do you ever have the opportunity to collect the lithostones or etching plates, etc.?
We do, and that's a great question. And they are extremely valuable for when those classes I was talking about earlier, when they come in to learn about the different printmaking processes. We have a number of etching plates for which we have the final print. We only have one piece of limestone. The Bavarian limestone that is used for lithography is very expensive. And so if your print shop at like UTSA, say they have a collection of lithostones, they are treasured and they are used time and time again. So with that Schreiber, his stone would have been completely erased. That design would have been erased and the stone reused because the stone is so expensive. So it's harder to come by a lithographic stone, but we do have a number of etching plates. And our lithostone is not one that was used to create art. It was actually used at a commercial print shop to print checks and invoices and things for business back in the 19th century. That's a great question.
I think I have one last one for you.
All right.
Someone on Instagram wants to know, do you have plans for any of these works of art to be on view in the galleries in the near future?
So actually, yes. I'm working on an exhibition for next year that'll be called Watermarks, and it's all images of water in the collection. So one of the key images will actually be that Ivan McDougall of the shell hunters that we saw very early in the presentation. So again, if anyone knows where that was painted, I would love to know before I put it in that exhibition. Do we have time for more art or? Okay. So these are not framed, so we'll have to see them a little bit differently. This is an incredible Aqua Tent by the Bay Area artist Beth Van Hoosen, and it's called Aegean Poppies. And so all of the color that you see is printed with an Aqua Tent plate, a copper plate. And when I think of summer, I often think of big fields of colorful flowers, such as these poppies. We have quite a number of works by Beth Van Hoosen in the collection. They were all given to the McNay by her estate. She didn't really have strong gallery representation during her lifetime. And so when she died, her estate was able to disperse the collection to various art museums around the nation. And we got a beautiful group of her work. So elegant and simple, and yet so incredibly difficult to do.
Izzy VS on Instagram says, they look so fragile, beautiful.
That's great. This is a work by Laura Lopez Cano, who is actually a Texas artist. She lives in Seabrook, Texas. And this, I believe, was printed at Coronado Studios up in Austin back when Sam Coronado, our dear friend, was still running that operation. He encouraged many Latino and Latina artists to come to Austin, especially artists who had never made prints before, to come to Austin and learn the screen printing process. Again, as I said earlier, screen printing is a relatively less expensive form of printmaking, and it's easy to teach. The reason I pulled this is, actually this is a fairly recent memory. I was on a road trip on Highway 90 out to West Texas in my little COVID bubble, and came across a beautiful field of sunflowers. And I always think of sunflowers when I think of summer, and especially the way that they turn their little heads to follow the sun, just like we all follow the sun when we go to the beach. And that's called simply Mujer con Flores. The McNay has one of the top contemporary Latina print collections in the country, so this is a beautiful example. Now, for those of you who have children or have raised children, this next image might be familiar to you. This is Laronda Brunoff's What Could Be Better Than Swimming in the Summer, where you see Babar, of children's book fame, lying by the water. And since he is the king of the elephants, you see his crown. He's sort of resting since he's at the beach, so he doesn't have to wear the crown today while he's bathing and relaxing and sharing time in the water with his family. This is from a suite of screen prints. He's, as I said, mostly an illustrator and an author, but in 2006 he created a suite of 6 screen prints based on his children's books illustrations. So I thought that would be a really fun image to look at, thinking about summer.
Someone would like to know what the red boxes are in the background.
That's a great question. So the boxes behind, as I mentioned earlier, this room serves as a classroom, but also as our primary print storage. So each of the boxes that you see behind are called Solander boxes. He was a botanist, I think, at the British Museum, and he developed these boxes to really store his own specimens, his botany specimens. But someone in the print room at the British Museum saw the box and said, hey, that would work beautifully for our prints. So within each of the Solander boxes, there's about 20 matted prints. So the Solander boxes, of course, keep the prints in the dark, so light can't damage them. They protect against temperature and humidity fluctuations, because such fluctuations can be damaging to works of art on paper. And they also, knock on wood, would keep out any kind of insect that might want to get in the box and eat the paper inside. So it's a great question, yeah. So most of our collection is stored not in frames, but in mats and within these special boxes. It's a great, very observant question. All right, so the last object I've pulled is Frank Romero, and it's called Yellow Car, Woody. It's actually a Packard Woody, so a wooden, a station wagon with wooden sides. You can see the detail on the doors of the wood panels. So sort of the classic road trip vehicle. Frank Romero is one of the pioneers of the Chicano art movement in Southern California, a culture that is, not only fascinated, but really obsessed with cars and car design and highways and road trips. And so when I thought about summer, I immediately thought about this particular Frank Romero, because again, it reminds me of vintage vehicles used for road trips in the American West.
So we've actually gotten multiple questions wondering what the oldest print is in the McNay collection.
So our collection is really, really focused. Most print collections, let's take the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, for example, which is the largest print collection in the country with over 1 million objects. Their collection goes all the way back to the very earliest prints, not only Chinese, but all the way back to the very first Western European prints as well. We really begin in the early 19th century with the great master Francisco Goya, and we go up to the present. So we don't cover anything old master-wise. We don't have Rembrandts or Dürers. So the collection really starts about 1800.
That's wonderful. Well, if anyone else has any last questions, we are wrapping up. Someone did want to know, how do you decide what to show in exhibitions?
So we have ideas, and we, as curators, we present them to our curatorial team. We discuss their merits and also discuss how they will fit in to the overall exhibition program at the museum, as well as with our, our mission. So I try to put out things from the collection that is always something to appeal to everyone. So it's a very eclectic collection. So it's also a very eclectic exhibition program as well. But oftentimes it's going through these boxes that people were asking about, looking for a particular object, say for a class, or to develop a checklist, and seeing something in the box that triggers something in me that's, hey, you haven't shown that, or you haven't shown that in a long time. Wouldn't it be nice to do a show about XYZ? Whether that's a specific artist in the collection, like Beth Van Hoosen, we've done an exhibition of her work before, just because I felt that she deserved to be better known. The exhibition that's in the Lawson Print Gallery right now that's about to open is all contemporary drawings in the collection, and the impetus for that was the fact that I was going through drawing boxes again and just realized that that part of the collection had really developed beautifully in recent years, and really no one knew it. So that show will be an opportunity for our audience to see a part of the collection they may not have known about before.
Okay, well, it looks like that will be the end of our live this evening. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you all for coming, and please stay well.